A heat wave is upon us, and that's already the second time this year. And in fact, I think it's the 5th heat wave in 3 years. So what do you do when temperatures reach a very, very hot 35 Celsius and your trees are sitting in your garden? How do you deal with that? Today I'm going to share with you 5 tips to save your trees from getting damaged in the middle of summer. The trees get hotter and hotter. Now, how do you deal with it? How do you make sure that your trees stay healthy and alive throughout the summer without going through extreme measures? Of course, weather in which the tomatoes start to wilt and even the weeds in your garden can't hold up their leaves anymore is too hot for your bonsai as well. So you need to take some measures. So right now we're having 33, 34 degrees Celsius. Going to 34, 35 over the weekend, and yes, that is almost 100 Fahrenheit for those that not use, well, I would almost say normal temperatures. In any case, it's hot. Now, what can we do to protect our trees? We can of course store trees in a fridge if you have one, and if you only have 1 or 2 small trees, but it's quite impractical, and in fact it's not all that good for the tree either. Not only will I give you a number of tips on how to keep your trees happy and healthy throughout summer, no, I will also explain 2 myths in bonsai regarding watering. It's the middle of summer. It really is bloody hot. It sometimes feels that only the tropicals really enjoy this weather. So how hot does it really get in a pot? Let's do a little experiment. So thermometer sensor right here at the edge. Fill it up. So I left the pot outside overnight and we had a low of 14.5 Celsius. Right now it's about 28 degrees and the pot is getting quite hot at 40, 45 degrees. Let's see what happens when we add a bit of water. How much will it cool down? And now if we check 10 minutes later, temperature still has not reached the 40 degrees again. So really this makes a big difference whether your pot is well watered or not. One of the things I often hear is that people are worried about sunburn on their trees. I'm not all that worried about sunburn, to be honest, and I don't think I've had a lot of trees just get burned by the heat or by the sun. It's not the sun that's typically causing the damage. Scorched leaves, brown tips, maybe even complete branches dropping off, flowers wilting, tips disappearing. Nobody's looking for that. And most of the time people blame the sun for this, and partially it's correct, partially it's not. So what can you do when temperatures are going to go up, and they're going up high in the 30s, maybe reaching 100 Fahrenheit during the day, and you have some bonsais? Well, of course, if you have one bonsai, you can just pick it up and put it somewhere else. You take it out of the sun, you put it into the shade. That's the best strategy. But as said, it's not just the sun doing the damage, it's actually also the wind. What happens is the tree heats up, it's very warm, and the wind blows, and the plant wants to cool down, and it's starting to evaporate lots and lots of water. Now, if there's a lot of wind, it needs to evaporate even more water, putting lots of pressure on the roots. Now, if a pot is in the sun, like these are here, the pot gets really hot. But the roots get hot, maybe the pot gets a little bit dry, the root tips die, and at that point they can't take up water anymore. And at that point, no more water is being pumped into the system, and the leaves start to dry out, the tips get brown, and everybody says, "Ah, look, I've got sunburn." Yes, you've got damage to your leaves due to the heat and to the wind, but not to the sun. Sunburn looks different. Sunburn is not on the tips of the leaves, it's not on the edges of the leaves, it's actually on the highest parts of the leaves that are most exposed to the sun. So my Japanese maples right now are in full sun, and the only damage I have is from some dry wind. Some tips of the leaves dried off, but right now, today, new growth is looking great. First one, very, very simple, of course. Make sure you water. With this sort of weather, my trees get watered twice a day. My substrate is very open and water can easily penetrate through it, but also it dries out quite quickly. So every day in the morning I water my trees and in the evening I water my trees. Key to keeping your trees well watered in the middle of summer is to make sure you actually water them well. I see a lot of videos that do this. You put your tree in a bucket, you fill the bucket with water, and then you just let it sit for 20 minutes and your tree is well watered. You take the tree out of the pot, you let it drip out and you put it back on the bench. That is not what I mean with well watered, and realistically, it is not very practical if you have a lot of trees. On top of that, by dunking trees multiple times in the same bucket, you run the risk of spreading diseases. So I would recommend, do not fill buckets with water, but do this. When you water your trees, water them twice. The first time you water them until the water comes dripping out from below the pot. Then you wait 10-15 minutes and you top them up. That way any dry parts in your pot will get completely saturated with water. So as the core of the root ball dries out and the root take up more water, slowly but surely the core of the root ball may become so dry that it's hard for them to take up water. If you first water the pot, then you let that sit for a couple of minutes and then you water again, a lot more water will be taken up by the pot and your tree will take a lot longer to completely dry out. What do you do for your trees when it gets hot? I think there's a lot of creative solutions out there. So if you have a solution that's not mentioned in the video, go down, pop a comment. And of course, if you have picked up something new in this video, go down, subscribe to this channel. I'd be quite curious to know what you do to keep your trees cool throughout the heat wave. Second thing you can do to help your trees survive this heat. As I said, often it is the pot heating up that is the problem. So one way to deal with that is by using a cloth, maybe wet, maybe dry, ideally it's wet, and you wrap that around the pots that are most exposed to the sun. By doing that, you protect the pot from overheating because the ceramic doesn't get sun directly on top of them. If you do that, easily you can lower the temperature of your pot by 5 or 10 degrees, which might just be enough for the roots to stay alive a bit longer. Option number 3. One of the things that I've installed in my garden is a misting system. All along my trees I've got some water lines, and on the one hand you can have somebody at home, like yourself, your partner, a friend or a neighbor, who in the middle of the day, the hottest part of the day, switches on the water. The misters will create a mist of water, cooling down immediately the foliage but also the pots of all your trees. And I can already hear some people think about one of the big bonsai myths. No, water doesn't burn leaves of trees. This has been disproven so many times, it's actually not even worth talking about anymore. Having a misting installation in my garden is only useful a couple of times a year, and I don't use it on other days because my water that comes from the well is quite rich on calcium and it leaves white stains on the leaves. So that's a downside of doing it this way, but it's very effective. It easily drops the temperature around the trees 10 degrees Celsius in one go. No problem whatsoever. And that might just be that little bit of a push for the trees to stay happy and healthy throughout the day until you can water them properly. Number 4 is more of a substantial way of dealing with it. If you want to reduce the solar radiation reaching your trees, what you have to do is start to put netting on. There's big nets that you can buy and they will let through maybe 30% or 40% of the solar radiation, so filtering out maybe half of it. That's enough to really keep the trees cool. But then for trees like pines and piceas and maybe even the junipers, you're actually putting them in a quite dark spot. So in my garden I don't use the nettings. Providing shade for your trees, of course, is a very good way to deal with the heat of the day. Keep your trees protected from the sun and from the wind and use a natural cover for it, like this big tree here. This tree is standing at a strategic position so that at the hottest time of the day, my trees actually stay quite humid. Putting your trees underneath a big tree is a big help in keeping it cool during the heat of the day. So many of the things that you can do to keep your trees humid in the middle of summer depend on actions for an individual tree at that specific time of the year. And that is because I am in a fairly cold and humid climate in the winters. There is a more structural thing that you can do as well. the more organic matter, say cocoa husk ground up, or peat moss, or maybe even bark, you put in your substrate, the easier it is to store more water in your substrate. The downside there, of course, is that if you have a rainy winter like I do, then the pot stays wet throughout the winter. They don't have a chance to dry up, and then roots might die. So it is a trade-off. If you live in a very dry climate and your winters are typically dry, or you can put your trees away in a dry spot, adding organic matter to your substrate in a higher volume than I do might be very useful for you, and your trees will stay more humid throughout the summer. One of the important parts of protecting your trees is making sure they have the right position. So there are species that endure full sun all day long, every single day, no matter how hot it gets. Pines are one of the examples, and if well watered, junipers also. Then there's a lot of people who get lots of problems with Japanese maple, and they might do better in a bit of shade, the same as yews. So when you are planning your garden, make sure that for the positions that get most sun during the day, that is the corner where you put your heat resistance and your sun resistant species. Whereas if you have places where there's more shade during the day, say by a big tree, that's where you put the trees that like a little bit of shade in the hottest part of the day. Early sun, morning sun usually goes below the canopies of the trees in summer, and then they'll do fine. They'll get their 6-7 hours of sun, but in the morning and the evening, and during the day they get sheltered from the sun by a tree. There's a big risk of sun damage on the bark of recently defoliated trees, so make sure you keep those out of the full sun and put them in a shaded position. The same for recently separated air layers. They dry out fairly quickly if they're not well rooted, so keep them out of the sun and the wind during a heat wave. If you follow my channel, you'll know I'm a big fan of junipers. And one of the things that often comes up when you're talking about junipers and water is you should not water junipers all that often because they don't like wet feet. I am sorry, I disagree. My junipers love water. It is very important to make sure that your juniper is in a good substrate. And once it is in a good substrate, like this very open substrate behind me, you can water it constantly. I'm not gonna, because water is not all that available right now. But water your junipers twice a day when in full sun and in good substrate, and they'll be nice, happy and healthy throughout summer. It's a big myth to think that junipers don't like water. If you grow succulents, the same is true for succulents. Also, succulents love water when it's hot and they're in a good substrate. You can water them every single day and they grow perfectly well.